few moments, and you will notice that everybody has something purple on them to help them to stand out and show solidarity for women and children who are experiencing abuse in their own homes, in their Okay, can you hear me again? Good. So, can I hold something there? Sorry. No? Okay. Right, here we go. The Purple Up campaign was the brainchild of the Limerick Local Area Network on Violence Against Women, which is made up of a number of organisations who support women in the situations that they find themselves when they're affected by violence. So we'd like to thank you all and for your continuous support. Many businesses, shops, credit supported the campaign by dressing up their windows, dressing up their bodies, their children. There's a lady here who's dressed her dog, and everybody is just trying to show solidarity with women who find themselves in abusive relationships. So if you can just bear and hope that it'll keep going when the power is going now. Okay. So I'm sorry that this keeps cutting in and out, so you'll have to turn your and get ready. So we have a lineup here this morning. We have Tom Marr, who's an advocate with the White Ribbon Project. We have Garda Síochána. We have Tony, Senator Tony, and we have Marie, supported Survivors Group. So I'll now introduce you to Tom Marr, advocate who has come from Dublin specially to be with us today, and over to Tom.
Thank you so much, and it's a real honour to be in Limerick today, and it's fantastic to see so many of you come out and show solidarity for women who are victims of violence. To explain a little bit about who I am. My name's Tom Marr, and what we try and do is address violence in a social context and provide education and training to men and women, male socialisation, often taught how it's often aligned with violence, and to get these projects in different communities, and for the communities themselves to carry this project along and to work in this project. Being that works in your community, you know what people listen to in your community, you know how boys are taught in your community, that we get through to young people in the community and ask them to think about how it exists, what we can do about it, and address kind of how we teach boys and men, and how we often align. Fortunately, there's no community in the country that is immune to it. So ending violence against women and girls can only be done with a cross-community effort. So no longer can we brush this under the carpet or use the language of exculpation or call it a private matter. No longer can we simplify or individualise or crime. We call it what it is. It's a crime that has its roots. It's an entitlement and inequality rather than in the pathologies of singular individuals. It's a crime that seeps out from beyond the home and feeds back into the society from which it comes, and we can't begin to address it about addressing the power imbalances and myths that surround it. So we need to send a very clear message to communities across the country about the reality of where this crime is perpetrated and by whom. It's essential we challenge the temptation to assume that this doesn't happen in our neighbourhoods or in our... This is why this critical mass is so essential in making it clear that we know this problem exists in our community and not just beyond it. 3 years ago I lost my wife to a man who decided that women were for male consumption and that it was his right to rape and murder her. But since then I've heard many people push this away as not a problem in society, but a problem of his individual psychopathy. We return to this place of denial, push the problem away and say it's true in other cultures but not ours. Other cultures may have specific problems, but often our motivation for highlighting those problems is to minimise the problem in our own backyard, to point to something in another culture and say things like, aren't our women lucky? They don't live in that culture, which of course is cold comfort to the 1 in 5 women in this country who suffer as a result of male violence. I remember one of the first times my masculinity got challenged was maybe in primary school when I was about 9 years old. And what happened was I backed away from a fight, and I realised that through my peers, through people telling me this, I realised that it's not okay for a man to back away from a fight. It needs that I need to be man enough to step up to that fight. What it also taught me was that being called a girl or being aligned with the feminine was aligned with weakness, was aligned with submission, and that was to be avoided at all costs. So when I backed away from that fight, I realised that my manhood was precarious and it was conditional. It was based on my outward behaviour rather than who I was as a human being. So in a desperate grab for acceptance, that other kid in me eventually fought, even at the time I knew that neither one of us wanted to do that. This is a rather typical story of how we learn violence is attributable to being a real man, but also in how we learn that this violence is by default a position of strength, of dominance, and it's opposite of the feminine is what is most to be avoided. And you learn lots of things about dominance and how it's aligned to masculinity when you grow up in almost every culture in the world. You learn that work that women do is undervalued or free. You learn that a man's home is his castle. You learn boys will be boys. What do we mean when we say a man's home is his castle? Do we mean that he can act with impunity within that home? Do we mean that laws don't apply to him in that home? Do we mean that he can commit crimes in that home? We can't. What does that say to people outside that so-called castle? Does that say that is none of our business? That the impunity that he imposes on the people in his home is none of our business? This is what we have to challenge. So what do we mean when we say boys will be boys? Are we saying that we expect boys to misbehave? Are we saying that we expect boys to be violent? We need to challenge this as well in every community. Imagine you're a young boy and you cry and an adult man tells you not to be such a girl. What do you learn from that? What tools have been taken from you? You learn that boys are not allowed to access that particular emotional expression. You learn that we can't access all the coping mechanisms available to us. You learn that crying is for girls and therefore inferior. So if that is the case, what are we teaching boys about a woman's value and about respect for women? What does a boy hear when he's told he has to be powerful? He's ordered to block out anything that makes him feel vulnerable. This is in fact disempowering for boys. This tells us that any appearance of emotion is weakness and needs a masculine outlet. It confuses anger and fear and rage, which are normal human emotions, with violence, which is a behaviour. Naming this problem means accepting that there are historic and structural problems that perpetuate male dominance and gendered stories that damage boys' and men's sense of humanity, and we end up with an intolerable amount of death, physically and psychologically tortured by those who report to love them. So many conversations begin with men becoming defensive when I say that not all but the majority of violence and violence perpetrated by men. We're so wrapped up in this identity of maleness that we personalise it when a true state who perpetrates the violence. We don't say this to shame men, but to ask why this is the case. This is something men need to explore more closely without. When I say violent men, I do not mean all men, but this is an assumption that is often made. In Victoria and Australia recently, they released across the school board and across primary and secondary education respectful relationships, and it's a syllabus that teaches boys and girls what a healthy relationship should look like, what it is a healthy relationship looks like. This is an approach we need to follow in Ireland. So surely these issues should be not only fundamental, but prioritised in a civilised society. Instead, these things are marginalised or seen as luxuries or add-ons in our education systems. This is why we look to empower people we engage with to take this work institution. As much as we need to keep advocating for structural change in how we educate in this issue, we can't wait for education systems to make this a priority, but we can empower ourselves, the people and keep communities, carry these projects forward in sustainable ways. This stuff needs to be embedded and sustained at a community level to make any dent in those numbers. Men and boys need to believe in transformative change from within themselves and in the wider culture, and be vocal about making that change. There's a problem as well with defining violence. The problem with defining violence needs to be very much part of this education. There seems to be no standard for how we understand violence, particularly in relationships. Not legally, and certainly not socially. Violence is done psychologically, emotionally, financially, as well as physically. Violence in relationships is about control and creating dependency, and this can manifest in a number of ways, from controlling to threatening violence, to hyper jealousy, sexual abuse, and isolation from friends and family. And lack of education in these forms of abuse can lead the victim to doubt whether she's been abused enough, and also lead the abuser to tell they're telling themselves and their partner that what they're doing is not abuse. Essential to this is to teach our kids about healthy relationships and boundaries, to make sure they understand that a relationship does not mean ownership of another person, that it does not give them the right to sexually access that person without clear consent. What's interesting about the work we do is often that when we talk to boys and men and ask them what they don't like about being a man, they can give us a list of examples. And this sort of prohibition on emotions and expression of emotions. Also, their expectations of being a man. But we ask them what they like about being a man, there's often a pregnant pause. There's a real reluctance to take care. There's a reluctance to see or speak about what's good about ourselves, or what's caring or kind about ourselves. Many men find it difficult to express the kindness and compassion inside themselves. By peer policing that puts pressure on men to be silent and exude dominance and power, even and perhaps especially when we feel vulnerable.